Right, which brings us around to the snare drum. Snares vary in size, style, the skins come and go, there's fashions, but one thing that remains is the SM57. It certainly sounds good in a snare. That's your classic sound. It's evolved, and again, when I say evolved, I mean from the 70s, I suppose, or from the 80s. Various techniques in years gone by. But the idea of the 57 is it's a dynamic mic, takes lots of pressure. They like them on snares partly because of the presence boost, I'm sure, like they do give you a bit of added crack from the mic. Having said that, I don't like 57s on the snare and I don't use them myself. I do occasionally recording where I can control where the mic is, but I just don't do it live, and the main reason is the buggers knock the tops off them. At different times in the past, my friends and I have laughed thinking, well, they should have called the 58 the snare mic because that'll take a good drumstick, and called the 57 the vocal mic because it covers less of your face. You can get right up in the diaphragm, like it looks better, and it might break your teeth, I suppose, but it won't do any harm. But the 57 is the classic sound of rock snare. And just because I don't like getting the tops knocked off my 57s doesn't mean it's not a good mic to use if you're not worried about that. I use something like this. It's an Audio-Technica equivalent kind of thing. It is a drum mic, high dynamic, high power handling, fast diaphragm, hypercardioid pattern. And it's got all sorts, it's got, my finger, I can see them, it's got dented all over the top of it. Now, any one of those hits that's put a dent in that would have had the top off the 57, no worries. You can have them back off the snare, but inevitably they get moved, or, not inevitably, but they can get moved. You do lose control of where they are live often. Anyway, now, most of a snare sound, like most of the instruments, comes from the player. Having said that, the places to mic them up, this is normal if you've got one rock. It's a rock band, you've got one mic on the snare or one position, this is where you would put it first. They really do sound good and fatter if you can get the microphone up over the drum, but it gets riskier the more you do, even though the sound improves. If you can get the sound right in here, really good. You really get a big fat bottom end off it, but you can't, it's impractical. As you move the mic around, take it off there, more to the side, like there, you get a very woodblocky, MIDI, woody sound. That sometimes can be useful live. Again, depends on your act. It's not so much a rock technique. It's more of a jazz thing. Or some old-timey kits, but sometimes if that can give you a very interesting sound. And the other way to do the snare, or the very popular other thing with the snare, is the underneath mic. The snare wires are underneath the drum, and they're what rattle and gives it the distinctive snare sound. And a lot of times people like to mic that up. Now, it is a very fine, fast sound. There's an argument for using a condenser mic under the snare because there's a lot more high detail when you really get up close to those rattly snares than you hear from the top of the drum. But the condenser under there does hear very wide, like it tends to hear as much kick drum as it does under snare. So that's the reason for perhaps not using a condenser, even though it's a good sound. So again, often people just use the same type of dynamic as they'd use on the top. Because when you hit the drum, that one goes that way, the bottom one goes down. These end up hearing the drum from a different phase perspective. If this one's said to be positive, then the bottom one is out of phase with the top mic. So if you blend the sounds together, you actually do get quite a deal of cancellation. That's why the mic underneath needs to have its phase flipped, either at the mixing console or with a phase lead, or just use a special mic that you know. If they're not out of phase, or they're not out of phase with each other, then you really invalidate the underneath mic. You lose fatness and get lots of cancellation. It's not as good as just using a single mic. And the other approach is to use condenser mics, or a single mic or a double one. Condenser, one mic will probably do the job because it'll hear wide, and will have a more top-end response, more high-end kind of crunchy detail than you'd get off a dynamic. So a single mic may work. and will give you a nicer sound. Anything to do with brushes or anything to do with a real that sort of sound, the condenser will also pick up better than a dynamic, again, because it's got the faster and increased high-end response. But like whenever you use condensers with anything live, you've got to consider that they are hearing all over the place. They really are hearing a lot wider and further than the dynamics. So your sound will be affected by that. It will be, all of the drums will be getting into the snare mic much more than it would with just a close pattern dynamic.